Ladies and gentlemen, we've got some leaked phone calls between two Russian soldiers, and we are going to get some insight into the Russian rotation system for its troops, or rather their lack of rotation. And we're going to break down some of the other rotation systems throughout history and how they impact troop morale. Let's get into it. This, of course, coming to us from Insight from Ukraine and Russia. I always link to it down below. You guys should give his channel a follow because I only listen to like 10% of the videos he's got on there. And I don't know what his source is, but he gets some wild leaks. All right, let's get into it.
To the intercepted phone call between two Russian soldiers that you're going to hear right now, there will be big changes in the Russian army in September of this year. So let's listen to this conversation.
Okay, real quick, what I want to point out first off is that one of the failings of the Russian military is that there isn't a good chain of command for orders, especially from the Kremlin down, right? There's a sort of basic chain of command for military instructions, but in the US military, right, it'll be common for, let's say, the Pentagon to change policy, and then they will release a document that will delineate that policy, but it'll be distributed to every soldier with an email. And that ensures that policy guidance goes directly through, pervades immediately through the chain of command, right? It allows everybody to see the same information and operate with the same perception of reality or of the guidance. If you don't have that, again, Russia, which is operating in a less computerized, less electronic army, in addition to having more poorly trained conscripts, you're just not going to get that. You're not going to get that same sort of flow of information. And so I say that because this is a conversation between two Russian just soldiers at random. So there is no guarantees that any of their information is at all accurate, right? It could be spot on, but it could also be just totally made up rumor, because that's what happens in the absence of information. People begin to fill it with whatever, conspiracy theories, rumor, innuendo. They try to read the tea leaves, so to speak, look at tiny actions or changes and try to tease out whether they mean they're part of some grander design.
Слушай, ты в курсе, да, что Санек-то умер?
Да, конечно, я в курсе. Ждем его здесь.
Уснул ночью, утром не проснулся.
Ну, ты что сделаешь? Он контуженный, да, был?
Да, его контузило, он 2 дня, видит, еще прожил как-то.
So he's talking about, they are describing a comrade of theirs who they say passed away. They say, quote, he went to sleep and, quote, never woke up. Then the other soldier says, well, what could you do? He was shell-shocked, right? And the soldier responds, yeah, he was shell-shocked and managed to live for 2 days somehow. This is interesting because they seem to be using shell-shocked in a different way than it was used. So shell-shock was a term originally from the First World War because, again, it was sort of defined by artillery barrages in which soldiers would experience extreme versions of PTSD, where they would see sometimes they would have like central nervous system damage. They would shake uncontrollably, right? Let's see if we can find the video of it. It's because you have to think, right? Here we go. This is Shell Shock documentary from 1917. We will get rid of that. But these are just some examples. You can see these soldiers have had serious central nervous system damage, right? Trembling uncontrollably. And usually what happens, right, in modern warfare, by the time you get to this point, like, my only theory is that these soldiers are soldiers who have been traumatized. And I know everybody on TikTok's been traumatized nowadays. But this is not like your 19-year-old TikTok influencer who was traumatized because she saw a scary story on the news. These are soldiers who watched human beings blown to pieces every day. So I point for every day for years. So I say this because you should understand that I'm not throwing around this term. but you can see that there wasn't a recognition of psychological wounds, that combat stress, which is what they called it in the Second World War, it could diminish a soldier's ability to fight. Instead, it was just seen as mental or moral weakness. So imagine you take somebody who's basically non-functional because they have such bad PTSD already or combat stress, and then you keep them in combat. And that's my theory as to why you don't see much PTSD like this, right? And you could see, right? Interesting. They call it, let's see if we can find this here. In it, war hyperthyroidism, hyperadrenalism. So hyperthyroidism is different. That's a like physical ailment. But they seem to describe it as, right, buried by shell. Interesting. Look at this. This is a private read, age 32, buried by shell, 2nd of August. So probably had an artillery shell go off very near him, so much so that it buried him in the dirt. Describe it as having a hysterical gait, swaying movement, nose wiping tic. Symptoms persisted until admitted netly 5 months later. Film taken day after admission. Okay, this is interesting. So this sounds like someone with like very acute PTSD, right? You could see. Okay, so what this actually probably is not PTSD. This is probably neurological damage from being. This is an MTBI, a traumatic brain injury. I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing some sort of traumatic brain injury, right? The awkward gait is probably like some sort of maybe inner ear damage would be my guess. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. Don't listen to me. But you can see that even though, right? Almost normally is a stretch. And right, you can see he's being rehabilitated on a farm. Right, here's a corporal with another change to their gait. This is really fascinating to me because these look so different from what we think of as PTSD symptoms. But again, I suspect that what they're really describing is partially PTSD, right? Partially like the brain's response to this traumatic event, but it's also literally a severe traumatic brain injury, which is, destroyed probably their inner ear. So they no longer have a capable balance. They've lost a lot of their fine motor movements. And so when they're saying shell shocked here, I think what they're describing is that someone who had a shell detonate very close to them, an artillery round, likely causing a really bad brain injury, and that they probably succumbed to that injury 2 days later. Right. And as distinct, because remember, shells will damage you through shrapnel, right? The actual metal parts of the round flying off in different directions, becoming little projectiles. But if you're really close, the actual concussive blast, the actual kinetic energy is what rattles your brain and damages internal organs and other parts of you. So they could literally be using shell shock just to describe being wounded by the concussive blast of a artillery round.
Это что, прилет был или что?
Слушай, их посадили, там прилет за прилетом был, они сидели в окопах.
Ну, у нас так же было.
А мы там бегали под минометным огнем.
Да не сказали, что там.
Yeah, they're saying that they were placed there. They were placed in fighting positions and were hit again and again, just being forced to sit in their trenches. The friend says the same thing happened to us, and that the other soldier was like, we were running under mortar fire, so they were likely engaging in some sort of counterattack, but that it destroyed an entire regiment.
Да, всех туда вытащили. Мы что катались?
Вы где были, под Солидаром или под Артемовском? Где вообще хоть были?
У нас Солидар слева. Артем.
Okay, so it's interesting. This friend, or this soldier, is describing fighting near Soledar and Bakhmut. So he's saying between Soledar and Bakhmut. So let me pull this up on the map real quick. I'll let you guys see it. where he's describing the fighting taking place. So he's likely a member of probably either Wagner Group, but more likely, I think, the Russian airborne forces. So the fighting is likely here, because here is Soledar, here is Bakhmut, or Artemovsky, whatever they call it. And you can see in the last maybe month or so, right, there's been some movement along this front line near this Okrivo-Vasilivka. You can see if we work back about 2 weeks, there is some changes, right, to this front line here. And you can see there's also been some fighting near the Burkiva Reservoir. This has been pretty intensive. While it may not look like a ton of progress, there's been a lot of back and forth here. So I suspect that he's probably either part of this motor rifle brigade, what they're calling Storm Z units, or the motorized rifle battalion. So that's where I think he was fighting.
Слева, справа солидарно. Ну, стрелял вообще-то 200 на 200.
Ну, у меня пацаны посрать не могли с блиндажа выйти. Нас
Я также копии сразу.
Right. And when you see these stories where they talk about being unable to go outside their trench and, it can't leave for anything. Remember, these are parts of the front line where there has been not much movement, but it doesn't mean that there's not much fighting. Across the front line, this fighting is very intensive.
Ну, а что делаешь-то? Криминал. Да я послал командиров, я же в бою контузило. У меня 2 сухожилия порванных было на ноге, на руке. Я в бой пошел.
Right. You see here, he says, I was shell-shocked during the fight, and then adds, I ruptured 2 tendons in my leg and hand. So I think it means that, like, I was damaged by a concussive
Меня
blast.
в бою контузило на отходе. Я командиров просился, говорю, отвезите в госпиталь, говорю, я вылечусь. Я слово мужика, говорю, даю, я вернусь. Они говорят, лежите, говорит, 3-4 дня, говорит. И давай, говорит, обратно. Надо, говорит, 5 блиндажей тебя забирать. Говорю, слушай, пошли.
Interesting. This is, again, sort of the chaos of the Russian military, where he says he had to make a deal with his commanders to get to the hospital to heal up. And he said, I gave them a man's word that I was going to return. And they said, no way, just lie. So lie probably means like go rest, like take 3 or 4 days where you don't do anything, and then go back to the trenches. We need to retake these 5 trenches. So they're probably describing that those small changes that we looked at in the map. That's probably those 5 trenches.
Развернулся. А у нас же ни документы оформлены не было. Нас, когда на передок привезли, у нас 13 автоматов на 30 человек.
Okay, wow. He says we didn't even have documents then. When we got to the front, we had 13 rifles for 30 soldiers. Wow.
Я говорю, мы за бабки выезжали. Мы платили, чтобы нас вывезли на КамАЗе.
And he says that they had to pay money to be withdrawn, paid to be taken out in KAMAZ, which is a truck. Wow.
Ну, мы оттуда, потому что поняли, что там просто мясо. Все.
Interesting. So he's describing basically desertion. He bribed someone to get orders to be withdrawn or to be taken out from the front line. Yeah, I mean, this is preposterous, right? Like, part of the deal in a military is that if you get brought in, especially by force, then you can't, like, the military owes you at least their best effort to keep you safe and keep you properly equipped, right? It's actually considered unethical or even a violation of the law of war in extreme cases to force untrained civilians to fight. Again, sometimes training can be very limited, but again, when you're forcing someone to charge at the enemy unarmed, that is some level of violation of the law of war, depending on your interpretation.
Просто там в расход, короче, пускали.
Вот здесь такая же.
У меня есть контакт человека, который нас вывозил. Если надо, могу скинуть.
And the friend says, oh, interesting. He says, I have a contact of a person, probably someone like an officer or someone in charge of personnel assignment, who accepts bribes and is willing to reassign soldiers.
Дальше, я не знаю, расформируют нас. Нет вообще. У нас вообще здесь человек 5, наверное, осталось.
Again, he says there's only 5 people left in his entire regiment, and the friend is encouraging him to take care of himself and his relatives. So you can see there's really not a rotation system in place in the Russian military. It just seems to be get out if you can, and if you have to stay, you stay until you're KIA, right, or WIA and can't return. And I mean, this is sort of wild, but this sort of system is a morale killer, right? So in the Second World War, the U.S. also had a bad rotation system. There was not really it was basically you were drafted in the military and you served until the war was over, which was, 4 years plus for a lot of soldiers. And obviously 4 years to be away is an incredibly long period of time. Especially when but when the whole country does it, right, it's a little different because the whole country kind of stopped, right? It was fully mobilized. So it wasn't like your peers were advancing their careers or, back home, getting married and having children, right? While you were waiting out your time in the war, everyone was sort of at war. So that was a little different. The problem is the replacement system. If soldiers would get wounded, they would oftentimes be cycled out of their unit, where they were oftentimes, had years of relationships built with those other soldiers. They had, a lot of soldiers felt their units were very well trained and experienced and understood their particular squad or platoon or company's tactics. They trusted their leadership. And if they were wounded, they would be sent back to a central depot. So imagine you're a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne. You think your unit is top notch, and you are then wounded, right? You're sent to a hospital. You take 6 weeks to recuperate. Then you're feeling good. You're sent back to depot and you're assigned to any unit across the front line that needs a light infantry soldier. So you could be with the 1st Infantry Division, somewhere else totally different. And for a lot of World War II era soldiers, there were actually a high number of desertions where the soldiers didn't go back home. They didn't go abandon the military. They would return to their original home unit, and they would serve there in a lot of cases. And again, that was a sign of just like the military didn't recognize that units function as individual soldiers that look out for each other. And so in Vietnam, they kind of corrected it. And so what they would do is a unit would be assigned to the Vietnam War. They would say, okay, the 25th Infantry Division is headquartered in Vietnam. And individual soldiers would be assigned to a squad, platoon, company, battalion within that formation. And they would serve out their year-long tour there. The thing that was interesting is that as the tour progressed, every month, a few new soldiers would come in and old soldiers would rotate out. And so by the time a soldier was due to rotate out, they would look around and they would see all new conscripts, all new soldiers, new to them. And that whole system also prevented in some ways units from training and being cohesive, right? But operating as a cohesive tactical fighting force, since institutional knowledge was always being bled away. So instead, the U.S. in the post-Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq and Afghanistan wars would rotate whole units, oftentimes at the battalion level or the company level in the case of like my military police company. So you would train a whole unit of 200 soldiers. You would deploy them together. They would do a year-long tour, and then the whole unit would come home. And that system, while logistically more complicated, allowed units to develop strong personal relationships, to work through the problems of how to function, how to operate, and it would allow them to learn and grow and improve their tactical and operational abilities together.
Из себя и своих родственников. Сейчас вообще говорят, в сентябре всех мобилизованных должны поменять. Сейчас, короче, по России такая, что контрактников набирают. Очень...
They say next month. So next month, he's saying in September, all mobilized soldiers will be replaced. Guys, they say, if someone starts a sentence with they say, just throw that sentence in the trash. Just assume that it's a total work of fiction. If you can't attribute who said it, then, and this is some life advice. All right. I'm giving you guys some life advice. Somebody tells you, they say that you shouldn't, drink Kool-Aid because the red dye will turn you into a crazy person. Like, okay, if you can't tell me who they is, then I can dismiss this. Like, it's okay to not, especially in the era of the smartphone where everyone has all human knowledge in their pocket. You could cite a source, man. You could cite a source. And if it's like, I read an article on some website that said that the airplane chemtrails are what turn, turn the penguins gay. You're like, all right, well, you're an idiot. So if you can't even attribute that, you should not put any stake in this September mobilized soldier is going to be replaced.
Очень контрабасов. Лучше соберитесь и едьте домой к семьям. Мой совет.
Also, remember, not one of those rotation systems involved wholesale replacement. The idea that and you were going to clear out an entire country, right? Like in Vietnam, they were not going to clear out every soldier from Vietnam and stick in new soldiers all in the same month. You would create nothing but crazy logistic bottlenecks. Same with the U.S. and Iraq and Afghanistan. Other than in the first 12 months of the invasion, you would not see whole units wholesale get pulled out and then replaced with new units. Not at a countrywide level. Again, the first couple of years they had to, because I think the U.S. didn't expect to have to rotate troops so much. But over time, they got to a point where they realized that you were better off always having brigades rotating in and out, 3 or 4 a year, because that system prevented a tidal wave of logistical issues as you tried to pull everyone, thousands, tens of thousands of troops out and put tens of thousands of troops in. There's no chance that this will happen in Russia, guys.
Ты вроде взрослый и понимаешь, что народ уходит и никто не возвращается.
Ну, это да.
А ради чего? А наша артиллерия почему молчит? У нас даже документы на нас не были оформлены, Лех.
Так у нас тоже такая.
Right. I mean, this is a real sign of just crushed morale, right? This sense that you will fight until you don't come home is a morale destroyer, right? And they ask, why is our artillery silent, right? Which is a sign, again, as we know, Ukraine has been pivoting, targeting Russian logistics. So seeing soldiers or Russian soldiers complain about their artillery going silent is a sign that I think Ukrainian efforts to diminish the logistic and munition support of Russian forces is having effects. Again, this idea that, there's not even documents issued for us. I think this is sort of interesting because a lot of people believe that the government, all the systems talk to each other. And if there's one thing that's come out, if there's one thing you should understand, it's that the government's ability to see itself, right? It's not like your body, right? Imagine all the different agencies, all the different employees are all different parts of your body. And if you stub your toe, you know right away that you've done it. Governments don't work that way. They're blind to what the left hand is doing, what the right hand are doing. It's almost impossible to coordinate them in real time. So this idea that the Russian government can't even produce documents, I assume he is referring to orders, like orders placing them in this place, placing them in Ukraine. The fact that their government can't even do it is an indicator that probably this guy's right. You could probably just walk away. Like you could probably literally just get in a car and drive away, and Russia probably would have absolutely no idea where you are. They'd probably write you off as KIA or lost in some operation, or and you'd go back and probably be fine.
Ну, вот и на это надо.
Это, говорю, законно, нет?
Ну, как тебе сказать, я с марта месяца дома.
It's not the first time I hear about the demobilization of Russia.
Right. He says, is it legal to just up and leave? And this guy goes, well, I've been staying home since March. So chances are he suspects that they may be looking for him as a deserter. But again, it's tough to know when you have, again, does Russia have the logistics and the tracking systems to go after every deserter, right? Especially when you're talking about lots of KIA, lots of WIA, lots of soldiers without documents, sometimes contract soldiers, mercenaries. It's almost unknowable.
Mobilized soldiers in September of 2023. I've been following a social media group in which wives of Russian mobilized soldiers discuss salaries, documents, and when their husbands are gonna return home. And so here is the post in which Maria asked in this group about the rotation of Russian.
Shout out to our boy Insight here, because he is okay. Let's give him a bet. Let's not pause it on such an awkward face. For doing some OSINT work on his own. That's what this is. Joining a closed Facebook group, he probably has a Russian name and a fake Russian profile that makes him appear to be a Russian sympathizer. And he's in all of these groups pulling out open source information. And again, these sort of posts are perfect examples of OSINT. Now you have to, with OSINT, you got to weigh it, right? Because you and I know that on English language Facebook, you can't believe anything on there, right? Your crazy uncle posting stuff, some weird patriotnews.net, there's all sorts of junk on Facebook. And you can imagine the level of junk that Russian Facebook brings to the table.
She got lots of responses from other wives who confirmed that their husbands are expecting the mobilization in September. And it's not just a feeling in their guts. There are real preparations going on at headquarters. It seems mobilized soldiers will be declared combat veterans. But of course, not everyone is so optimistic about it.
Right. This is interesting. Right. They talk about they've given them chevrons. This is recognition of some level of service completed and issuing certificates denoting them of combat veterans. This usually, so in Russia's case, the term combat veteran likely reflects the fact that they have deployed. In this case, it sounds like almost all of them would, like, going to Ukraine almost certainly put them in some level of direct fire or contact with Ukrainian forces, which would mean they're a combat veteran by both the U.S. definition and by this Russian definition. But it sounds like they are at least trying to get them the benefits they're entitled to. For example, in the U.S., because I deployed to Afghanistan, I was entitled to 5 years of VA healthcare for anything for free, right? And now that it's been over 5 years, I pay a nominal sum for VA healthcare. But this idea that they're sort of building out some of the paperwork around their veteran status, they're interpreting that as saying that there's going to be rotations.
Will be declared combat veterans. But of course, not everyone is so optimistic about it. Many soldiers assume that it's just going to be a rotation and that maybe their status will change from mobilized soldiers to soldiers in reserve. And so they'll be called up for service again after some time. I personally also tend to believe that they...
Yeah, Russia does not sound like it's in a place to rotate away. It sounds like it's probably going to be rotating soldiers. It probably realized that it has no choice. That may be one of the reasons that they launched this large attack in the north. And that may be a function of the fact that, as we saw with Wagner, when contracts are coming up, the incentive to launch a big offensive, to use it or lose it type mentality of Russian commanders tends to pervade. But again, guys, you got to understand, without real communication, without regular officers, without clear guidance, this is what passes for guidance. Everybody's rumor, right? Oh, my husband says in September they're going home. That's nonsense, right? It's just rumor. It's just made up stories, right? It's fantasy. It's fan fiction. Okay. In the absence of real meaningful guidance, you just get fan fiction. Trust me. I know this is how it is. Especially you want so badly for it to be true. I mean, I can't imagine not knowing when I'm going home, like just going to a combat zone indefinitely. It's like preposterous.
Again, because it's the nature of the current Russian government. Anyway, we'll see soon enough. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
All right, guys. Yeah, thank you as always. Be sure to check him out. And thanks to you guys for being fans. And I'll see you in the next one. Hit subscribe and like. Thanks.